Hey everyone, this is Tracy Friedlander. You're listening to Crushing Classical, redefining a thriving classical music career. Today on the show, I have Heather Malyuk. Heather is both a musician and an audiologist specializing in treating musicians' hearing. While Heather doesn't exactly fit the profile of a typical guest on Crushing Classical, I wanted to have her on the show to share this really valuable and not often talked about information about musicians taking care of and protecting their hearing. I don't need to tell you very much in this intro, except that you're going to want to hear this information and share this episode with as many musicians as possible. I learned so much from talking to Heather, and by the time the conversation was over, I was practically packing my bag to take a trip to her office to get fitted for custom earplugs. Before we get started, a couple of quick things. The doors are open to enroll in the Visibility Workshop, a 4-month program I designed to take you from clueless and confused around social media and audience building to confidently growing your online community and audience. Each participant will work on a visibility project over the 4 months, building consistent content around a specific intention you have for building your audience. If you already have started building your audience, this is a chance to expand and explore how you can monetize your audience and build a bigger audience for a specific intention. This isn't just audience building for the sake of likes and follows. You're finding your future clients, students, and fans. Watch for live videos on my Facebook page and inside my Facebook group Classical Cats around discovering your visibility project and what other people are doing in our space that you may not know about that is super exciting and also possible for so many other musicians. If you're interested in finding out more about the Visibility Workshop and to ask me if it's right for you, click the link in the show notes to book a call. I'd also like to thank Fix Music for sponsoring Crushing Classical. Fix has been my sponsor since the beginning of the podcast, and their business continues to grow and provide even more value. They now offer business accounts for choruses, orchestras, libraries, churches, and universities. This includes volume discounts of up to 25%. Of course, they continue to offer free shipping on all domestic orders, and they've also partnered with FedEx to offer 2-day shipping at insanely low prices, even to Alaska and Hawaii. They continue to expand their catalog with everything from high-quality jazz method books to elegant hardcover or text editions and everything in between. They are happy to take suggestions and requests from their customers, so if there is something you need, reach out to them through their website at fixmusic.com. They'll be happy to get it for you. And as always, use the discount link in the show notes to receive 10% off your first order at Fix. Let's get started. Hey Heather, welcome to Crushing Classical.
Hi, Tracy. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for being on. I'm so excited for this conversation because I know it's something so important, something that I've thought of for a lot of years, playing in orchestras and knowing that ow, there's some loud things happening around me. What do I do? Am I causing myself to go deaf? All these questions, but then you sort of, I don't know, you go home and it's kind of okay, back to life, back to doing this and that. I think generally maybe we take our hearing for granted as musicians sometimes, but we know that it's this looming possible thing that we could be damaging. So I can't wait to dive into this conversation about hearing health. So you're an audiologist.
Yes, I am an audiologist, who happens to be sort of hyper specialized in working with professional musicians and people within the entertainment industry.
That's so amazing that you can approach it so specifically to people who have hearing and sound around them for their livelihood,
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and you're also a violinist, which I think is really cool. It's a cool part of who you are that may or may not. I would think it would help what you do.
It does, because it gives me a somewhat unique perspective. And I worked as a pro musician before I became an audiologist, and I got a degree in music. And honestly, I can't even remember not being a musician. That's how long I've been playing. I've been sort of in music world since I was about 2 years old.
Wow.
I have two sisters who are pro musicians, and while it does help influence how I work with my patients and how I relate to them, and certainly kind of sharing that vocabulary, that's not necessarily what makes me a music audiologist. So just to make that distinction, many people get into audiology because they have a background in music, but working as a specialized music audiologist is a very niche branch of hearing conservation. So similar to
Mm.
what we see with industrial or factory workers. But that was a long answer for yes, my background is in music. And it does help me. I use it every day. I mean, I still work as a musician, and in terms of that background, I use it every day with my patients.
That's so awesome. And I wanted to have you on because this topic is so valuable to musicians, and I don't find this conversation happening out there in the world very much, but I know you're working really hard, and so I want more people to know about it. And one thing that, I mean, the main topic on this podcast is musicians who have had a career pivot of some kind, in some cases, and usually those people aren't going to another field, but I love the story of you going towards a career in music and pivoting out of music, but still serving musicians. That's so
Yeah.
interesting. So tell
Mm.
me a little bit about that realization you had when you realized you wanted to do something different from music.
Sure. I got a undergraduate degree from the University of Akron, here in Ohio. I got a degree in music history and literature, and I was focusing all of that in the world of ethnomusicology,
Hmm.
which usually I have to explain what that means, but I know for your listeners I won't have to, which is kind of a special treat today. You all know what ethnomusicology is. So I was enrolled in a master's program for that, and I was just at the beginning of it, and I realized something didn't feel right. My gut was telling me that that's not what I was meant to do. Which, those of you who have had that moment know it's strong when you know
Mm,
you're not doing what you're supposed to do.
yeah.
Um, so, to make a long story short, I was living with my parents, my family at the time, and I got to talking to them, and I said, I'm not sure what I'm called to do with my life, but I don't think this is it. So we sort of all chatted about it, very close with my family, and we do that. And I started looking up areas of healthcare because my family said to me, what do you think you're supposed to do then? And I said, I think I'm supposed to do something hands-on with musicians, and helping them in a more direct, immediate way. So I looked up different areas of healthcare. Nothing seemed right. And I saw an ad for the local AUD program, which is the doctorate that audiologists get. It's a clinical doctorate. And I went to the local library because you did that at the time. And I got some books on ear anatomy, hearing aids, things like that. And I was blown away by what I was learning. And I was also a little maybe regretful or resentful that I hadn't learned any of this as a
Mm,
pro musician, because I had struggled, a little bit, as most of us do, with some ringing in my ears and a little bit of sensitivity to sound and this and that. And I thought, why had this never come up for me?
right.
And so I did a 180 then, and I applied to that audiology school, and I was accepted. And I started specializing myself immediately. Um, Even to the point of, that was, oh my goodness, over a decade ago.
Hmm.
And at that time, I had started writing a curriculum for music schools, which I'm happy to announce is going to be released later this year.
Oh, great.
So it's been quite a path. But that's basically the story.
That's awesome. I love it. I love this story. So, um, we're going to dive into a whole bunch of details right now, but my first question just is if there was like really one thing that was burning in your brain that you really, really want musicians to know about their hearing health, could you tell
Mhm.
me like what that is? Just like one thing that people need to know before learning anything else about their hearing.
Wow, what a tough question. I think I think the one thing I would say is you are in control of your hearing. And what I mean by that is if you're experiencing or could perhaps experience anything caused by sound exposure,
Hmm.
you have control over that. And so the sooner you're educated and the sooner you develop a relationship with an audiologist, it the better for your career. So I think that's really the main thing.
That's awesome. Because, we have specialists for everything else. Women go to a doctor specifically for women, and we go to cardiologists. We go to the
Hmm.
dentist. I mean, even you don't always go to a cardiologist, hopefully, but you do go to the
Right.
dentist all the time and the eye
Yeah.
doctor. So
Hmm.
why aren't we going to the ear doctor regularly to make sure? I like the word that you used earlier. You think of it as hearing conservation.
Yes,
That's
that's.
really, really
Hmm.
awesome. So,
Yeah,
like,
I call it hearing wellness. In my practice, sound check audiology, my tagline is, expert hearing wellness. But if you look at the history of our field in terms of protecting hearing, the term is hearing conservation. And that really is, it is what it is.
yeah, because I feel like people pay attention like when they need a hearing aid. Like,
I know, yes, exactly. And, audiologists we're such a varied profession. And I think we're often associated with hearing aids. And the general population and musicians, especially, don't realize there are other branches of audiology, like myself, those of us on the side of protecting rather than amplifying.
that's awesome. So, does everyone need to run out and get custom earplugs like as soon as possible?
No, I mean, custom earplugs are great because they're your best bet for things like consistent attenuation of sound and
Hmm.
better sound quality than over the counter. I would say the first thing everyone should do is run out and get a hearing evaluation.
Okay.
That to me, I think that's something to do prior to getting earplugs. And a lot of musicians view that first appointment with the audiologist as kind of sales or a purchase.
Mm,
They call the audiologist when they need a piece of gear, but the gear's already on your head. It's your ears.
right.
And so going to the audiologist to learn how to care for your ears, what kind of hearing protection you might need, to get a baseline hearing test, that's what you should go out and do today. Not
Exactly.
necessarily look at buying earplugs, although I'd want you to think about that too, but go out and start caring for yourself.
That's so great. And so, like, we talked about this a little bit on our previous call because you said that there's some things you should sort of be armed with when you go to the audiologist for the first time. Like, if I'm hearing this for the first time, which basically I am, if you don't count our first conversation, like, what do I do? Open the yellow pages and just find an audiologist, or like, how do you find how do you find the right one for you, or because
Hmm.
you're in, everyone can't go. Well, you said some people do fly to you, so that's
Yes.
interesting. But yeah, how
Hmm.
do you, how
Yeah.
do you go about this whole thing, and what should you know going in?
So there are a few things. For me, I'm a mobile clinic, so I'll often go out to orchestras or schools of music, and I'll host a hearing wellness residency where I'll see maybe 80 people in a week for appointments.
Mm,
Um, but I'm sure some of your listeners are not in a situation like that. Maybe
right.
they're just one person gigging on their own. In that case, it's really tough to find one of us specialists. There currently, of course, at this point in time, here we are at the end of 2019, there are about 5 of us in the country who practice this full time
Mm,
as music specialists, and there's one in Canada that I know of. There might be more in Canada I'm not aware of, but one I know of. Um, so that's my nice way of saying chances are you can't see one of us.
right.
If you can't, what you just said is exactly right. Find your local friendly audiologist. Those of us who have an AUD after our name, a doctorate, have the same training in diagnostics. How we would test hearing, how we would talk to you in general terms. A music specialist is someone who would probably include more frequencies, so more pitches of hearing during
Mm-hmm.
testing, and would likely interpret the hearing test a little differently and talk to you a little differently, maybe ask you different questions. But anyone listening to this right now can go out to an audiologist, have a hearing test done, and should be armed with certain things in terms of what you want to tell that audiologist. So you would want them to know things like when you were last exposed to sound. If you make an appointment with an audiologist at 8 a.m. And you had a gig the night before till midnight that was rather loud, you want them to know about that.
Oh.
You want to be ready with information like here's how many hours a week I'm exposed to sound. If you've taken sound level measurements of your rehearsal rooms or Perhaps you're listening to this and you're in an amplified band and you're standing next to a drum kit a couple nights a week. You want to roughly know, what types of sound you're exposed to. This is all relevant for what's known as the case history portion of your appointment,
Mm.
because this goes beyond just your general, medical history. And most audiologists are not involved with hearing conservation, and they might not be ready to ask you these questions. So that's where that personal advocacy sort of comes in, as being in charge of your own sound exposure sort of knowledge in a
So
way.
you
And
need to go in and say, like, I need to share with you my sound exposure history
yes.
and my unusual case that last night we played a Tchaikovsky symphony and the cymbals were behind my head.
Yeah, exactly. All of that is relevant, as well as any non-musical exposure you've had. So, occasionally, I get patients who, were so focused on their music, and I had this one person many years ago who said, "Oh, I also work as a blacksmith. Is that something you'd want to know?" And I'm like, "Of course it is." So, any type of sound exposure is really something that you want to bring up to the audiologist,
Okay.
beyond music.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense too. I mean, yeah, if you're doing something like my hobby is construction, working on my house, and sometimes I use nail guns or whatever, you know?
Yeah. hmm
Yeah, okay. And then what else?
There are other things like, letting the audiologist know if you're currently wearing anything like earplugs or in-ear monitors,
Uh-huh.
especially,
Oh,
and let them know what you're doing sort of at the ear level.
okay.
I already mentioned hours of exposure. Looking at your week and saying to them, I'm teaching this many hours, I'm practicing this many hours, I'm performing this many hours is obviously super relevant. And then anything that you might be experiencing that would go under the umbrella of what we call music induced hearing disorders. So things like tinnitus, like ringing in your ears, or hyperacusis, which is a sensitivity to sound, or maybe pitch perception issues or distortion. That's all relevant. If you don't have any of those, that is fantastic. And, go to the audiologist and help prevent them. But if you do have them, that's very relevant information that you want to pass along.
Okay, that's really good to know. And that kind of goes into my next question because I really haven't, I mean, every now and then I'll get a ringing in my ear that goes away right away or whatever, but I know that can be something that happens to people. I've known people who have had other issues with sound, later in their careers, which ultimately, a lot of times causes their retirement maybe at a place where they weren't expecting to retire, things like that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about like what are some of the actual disorders that people have and maybe I mean, is there ever a thing that you could say specifically this causes this, or is it kind of unknown where that goes?
It's not necessarily unknown. We know that overexposure or overdosing on sound
Hmm.
causes certain disorders because it's injuring or damaging the cells in the inner ear.
Okay.
Sometimes people have heard the term hair cells. That's, these cells I'm talking about, that's what they are, cilia or hair cells in the inner ear, and they're responsible for sending the signal to the brain. Hearing doesn't happen in our ears, it happens in our brain. And our ears are really like an interpreter or a translator to take the acoustic sound around us in the world, the sound waves that we're surrounded by,
Hmm.
and get them in through this interpretation system known as our ear anatomy so that the brain can understand it, because our brain doesn't speak in the acoustic language, it speaks in electrical impulses. So
Mm.
anytime there's sort of a breakdown in that system, a variety of things can happen, and it will vary from person to person. Certainly you could just get what's known as, music induced hearing loss, or some people call it noise induced hearing loss. So that's happens in a specific frequency region,
Mm.
roughly 3000 to 6000 hertz. If you're someone listening to my conversation with Tracy and you're not sure what that means, it's roughly the highest octave on the piano and a little bit higher.
Oh,
And
okay.
there's a variety of reasons that the hearing loss from sound exposure happens there. Everything from the resonant properties of your ear canal naturally amplifying sound to vascular health in the inner ear and mechanical injury. There are, again, variety of reasons which I won't go into right now. So that could be something that happens. Beyond that, or in conjunction with that, or even not having noise-induced hearing loss, you can get disorders of hearing. So there are plenty of people out there with hearing that's what we call within normal limits on a hearing test. Many musicians who come in and say, I've got ringing in my ears, I've got distortion at certain frequencies, this and that. And I'm going to give you the clinical terms for those. They're called music-induced hearing disorders, and they're tinnitus, hyperacusis, diplacusis, and dysacousis. So,
Whoa.
yeah, they sound fancy, but honestly, it's ringing in the ears, sensitivity to sound, pitch perception issues, and then I would call dysacousis distortion in terms of what we're talking about right now. And we know they come from sound injury mostly, although some individuals with tinnitus will notice that it's not necessarily from sound exposure. It could be dental issues or jaw issues. Musicians are athletes, and we do a lot of repetitive movements. So especially people who use mouthpieces. I had one patient I'm thinking of who had some issues with tinnitus, and we found out it was because of a different mouthpiece that was being used.
Oh.
So is that common? Not necessarily, but it's worth noting that
So
if you're
does it-
someone who has tinnitus, it could be from something like that.
Okay, so that means that some of these things might be treatable or curable to where it could get repaired?
Yes and no. It's possible. It's a very, very small percentage of people.
Okay.
I would say more in terms of musicians listening to this. Some of these things, like we think of things in terms of ear training. And I don't mean sight singing, not like music school, but like training our ears. For example, people who have hyperacusis, the sensitivity to sound, you can do sound therapy to retrain your auditory system. So that's an example. Another example would be someone who's dealing with a slight distortion or a perception issue. Over time, and I can think of 2 handfuls of patients right now who have been able to ear train to those disorders and still work effectively. So that's my way of saying yes, these disorders exist. And in the literature, in research, we see anywhere from a 32 to 74% incidence rate. They exist, but unless they're very severe, I don't see them necessarily affecting careers in a career-ending way.
Okay.
It's more of a annoyance and a heartache, if to put it plainly, in terms of a mental health standpoint. That the people who have these, wish they didn't. They can ear train to them, but it is a process. So I don't want to be on here on record saying, oh yes, these things can be cured.
Right.
Although there are 1 or 2 people I've worked with who had tinnitus, and it went away after a while because it was caused by something other than sound exposure.
Okay.
But usually there is a process involved with therapy and ear training.
Okay. And do people ever get misdiagnosed?
I'm going to say no, rather than giving you a complicated answer. I mean, and here's why I say that. If you're a musician who knows you have something going on, and you're saying, I'm telling you there's some distortion, you're not wrong about your own hearing. Musicians, more than anyone, certainly more than the general population, are way more in tune with their sense of hearing. Right. Even though we all tend to forget about it and not care for it, we know when something's off.
Right.
So even you couldn't really go to a provider and say, I have ringing in my ears, and for them to say to you, no, you don't, or something like that.
That makes sense. That makes sense. But having the understanding of what a musician goes through, like you said, that sometimes, I know that we've talked about, sometimes audiologists might say like, oh, this is career ending, and then it turns out, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yes, I know exactly what you're saying. That's more of a cultural divide.
Okay.
Yeah, so the way we talk about sound and the way we value sound in the music industry is quite different from sort of the dispensing audiologist. And that word dispensing, I mean sort of a hearing aid audiologist, although they're not called that. They're called dispensing audiologists. The person down the street who you might call to go get a hearing test from might test your hearing, and they might see some severe sound injury in your ears. and they might really scare you.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is, there are so many musicians who can play beautifully with severe injury. And no, none of us want you to have that. But if you have it, it's not too late for you, number one, to keep your hearing stable and keep working. There are so many resources for you and so many things you can do. And I can think of many examples in my years of practice where a musician has come to me in tears, has maybe flown across the country to see me because they've already seen a handful of audiologists and been told their career's over.
Mm.
It's always so heartbreaking for me, and I'm a crier, so it just ends up in like a sea of tears around us. But the heartbreak of it is that here's a musician who has trained for maybe 30 or 40 years to be
Yeah.
a pro musician, and to be told you have to go do something else because you risk hurting your hearing. Oh my goodness, no, not at all.
Right.
Not at all. What musicians, more than anyone I can think of, are talk about being hyper specialized. If you're a violinist who's been on a track to become an orchestral musician, and you're finally there, and you go get a hearing test done and are scared and told you can't work anymore.
Yeah.
Wow, how horrible is that? And honestly, that's not the audiologist's fault. That's on the end of being educated. And again, this is why you see a specialist. So maybe a hearing conservation audiologist or a music audiologist, I'd sit down with them and say, so we're measuring some injury here. Okay, you have it. I know
Right.
you have it. And now we take steps to prevent further injury and to work with what you've got. And the people who I have seen who are dealing with something like that are working wonderfully.
Mm.
It's so that's more of a cultural and a vocabulary divide.
Okay,
Um,
so to make a distinction, so is the cultural divide between, like you had mentioned, audiologists who are like hearing aid distributor types, and
mhm.
then there's another type of audiologist who's a hearing preservationist. So is this the cultural divide between these two different types of audiologists?
um, yes and no, because to be honest, there are hearing conservation audiologists who aren't music audiologists. So, you could go see someone who's used to running programs in factories.
Oh,
Doesn't mean they're going to be able to work with you as a musician. Uh, Audiology, I don't think people realize, is divided into a lot of subspecialties.
okay.
Uh, so, for example, that dispensing audiologist you might go see might know about every new hearing aid device on the market and be educated about them, where I might not be.
Mm.
So, just to put it sort of in the other terms, where if someone comes to me as a musician, I'm going to know about everything available to them to help them, and maybe more education for them in terms of information, how they care for themselves on a day-to-day basis, not just gear, but sort of the science behind everything. And I wouldn't expect another branch of audiology to know that, because who has the time anymore? It's just
Yeah.
like going to a general physician. They're not a specialist in everything. They're a generalist, and we need them too.
Yeah.
So that's my way of saying all audiologists are sort of a specialist in something,
Okay.
and so you can't necessarily expect everyone to know every little thing.
So it
Uh,
seems like to me, if you're hearing this conversation, you can say, "All right, I understand the things I need to be armed with when I go to the audiologist. If I show
yeah,
up to an audiologist and he says you or she says you have too much damage and I think your career is over," then you stay level-headed and you go,
yes.
I will go seek out Heather or some other audiologist who specializes for musicians and get a second opinion from somebody who is more versed in actually dealing with musicians.
That is exactly right. That is
Okay.
exactly right. And referrals in audiology don't necessarily work the same way, in that, that person might not know music audiologists even exist, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, that provider. But yes, that's where you would contact someone like me, or perhaps if you know one of the other music audiologists, and say, I want you to have a phone call with me. I do this all the time, where I'll get on the phone with somebody and they just say, I want some education about what I've got going on.
Mhm.
Or, maybe you would contact me and you'd say, well, I'm in such and such city. Maybe you're in Los Angeles. And I would say, oh, my good friend Lisa Tannenbaum, for example, is a music audiologist out there.
Mm.
And then you could go see her. I'd say, here's her email, set something up. So Yes, that would be a case where you would want to contact one of us and say, how can I speak with one of you, or how can I get an appointment with one of you?
That's awesome. And before the podcast is over, I'll make sure that we talk about how to get in touch with you and how, especially the piece that you said about how you go out to orchestras sometimes and do like a whole evaluation and everything. So I want to talk about that in a little bit. But I know one of the things I really wanted to talk about was that in addition to, and we're going to talk about actual protection on your ears, but you had mentioned to me things you can do in your space and your surroundings to minimize the damaging effects. And so I'm really interested in you talking about this because it's something that I didn't even think of until you mentioned it.
Yeah, so an example of who that might be effective for would be someone who is working consistently in one room. So, for example, a professor at a music school who's teaching in the same studio or same rehearsal space all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You can do what are known as acoustic treatments to your environment to lessen the sound levels. That would be an instance where you would want to work, with an acoustician, hopefully, to help you do that effectively. Or you can do something as simple as putting up surfaces that will absorb sound.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not here. Let me preface this by saying I'm not saying that anyone listening to me right now should go and do this, because I'm hoping in a minute you'll ask me about measuring sound levels, because that goes hand in hand with this.
Oh, sure.
To first figure out, even if are you at risk or not? Maybe you're not in your environment.
Okay.
But putting up something like drapes or putting a carpet on the floor, those are little things that you could do immediately. But ideally, you would want to work with someone who works in acoustics,
Okay.
who can come in and do sort of like some official measurements and things. Making acoustic alterations to environments might not work for you if you're someone who's going to a lot of different rooms. Perhaps you're someone who is gigging in a different space every weekend, for
Mm-hmm.
example. Those are the people who would want to focus more on the ear level protection. But yes, that's the answer to that question is yes, there are things you can do, things you can put up to absorb sound in your rehearsal space or your studio that will help lessen your exposure.
Right. I thought of this question just now and I didn't think of it the last time we talked, but do you know those Wanger practice rooms that are in music schools? Those little tiny like refrigerator door ones where it's like,
Yeah.
how are those? Because they always bothered me to practice in because, well, first it was really dead inside, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I felt like they were too loud for me to be in there practicing. Do you have opinions about those things?
To be honest, I haven't used one myself. I try to be so evidence-based, and I don't
Mm,
like to just say things. I would want to get into one and measure it before I
right.
say either way, simply because I haven't experienced one. I know what they are.
Yeah.
I mean, I know the name, but I'm hesitant to say either way because I don't want to give anyone not completely accurate information.
Right. And this podcast is not brought to you by Wanger.
Yeah, exactly. But actually, what I should do is, reach out to them and see if I could do some measurements and things.
That would be awesome. Yeah, I would be really curious because I know they're designed to keep the sound out of the space, like so that you can
Right.
have a ton of people. But what about the people inside those rooms?
Yeah, I mean, I know that they, and hopefully no one from Wanger's listening to this. I mean, I know they say that they're like maybe up to 30% quieter than other practice rooms, and that they're
Mm,
like tuned a specific way. But in terms of whether or not I could say, oh yes, these are a hearing conservation device, I can't say that for
you can't
sure.
say it until you measure it. So tell me
And
more about the
I
measuring.
doubt it.
Right, I
So
doubt
so
it.
yeah, so it just, it depends because a lot of musicians, so to lead into this measurement,
Yeah.
a lot of musicians are under the impression that it's other musicians hurting their hearing. And I
Mm,
mean that in two ways. The first way is saying, well, those people who sit over there, they're probably getting hurt, but I'm probably not. So that's something I hear a lot. And then the second thing I hear a lot is, man, it's the people who sit behind me who are really the issue. It's not my instrument. And that's true in some cases, but not all. So to speak as a violinist, I know as an audiologist that most of my exposure comes from my own instrument to my left ear.
mm,
There was a study done in years ago, 1996. done with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and they found that 70% of the violinists at that time had injury in their left ear.
Mm,
And so they were taking sound level measurements off the violin, things like that. Now, when I was a violinist, I never would have thought it was my instrument,
right.
that was
You want to blame
hurting.
the trombones or the
Yeah,
percussion.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not me. It's the piccolo,
Oh
who's
God, the
sitting right
piccolo.
behind me.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say is, yes, you can measure your own sound levels. The most accurate way to do it would be to put a probe microphone down your ear canal
Mm,
and sit it next to your eardrum. And the reason for that, the reason why you would want to measure there is so that you can really capture the acoustic resonance of your ear canal. So a lot of people don't realize, our ear canals are tubes and they will naturally amplify sound coming in.
hmm
Some studies show that they can amplify sound by as much as 30 decibels of sound pressure level. It's
Wow.
going to vary across the board. So if you take one measurement around a group of people and assume that that's going to be the level they're all exposed to, it's probably not exactly accurate.
Wow.
The other thing is when we look at studies, especially on orchestra musicians, they'll take sound level measurements at the shoulder. So if you like Google, orchestra musicians sound level measurements, you'll often see someone sitting there with a sound level meter sitting on their shoulder. Again, not necessarily 100% accurate because it's not taking into account the personalization of sound that's going into that ear canal.
So it's even specific to like violinist A has this violin, violinist B has this violin, and this bow.
That's
Like,
exactly right. That's exactly right. And I often say to people, to musicians, you can Google sound levels for instruments, but there are things that aren't taken into account, like the repertoire that was used, the hall
yeah.
they were in,
Oh my gosh.
yeah, the individual instruments, how many people were playing. There are a lot of things here that a lot of reasons why I say I don't really trust those lists you see. However, okay, now that I've sort of put a black cloud on everything, let me say that you can raise your awareness of sound and you can measure your sound. And whether it's you getting a professional sound level meter for thousands of dollars because that's what you want to do, that's fine. But there are also free apps now that are fairly accurate. And I'm assuming, since you brought up Wanger a minute ago, I'm assuming I can use, company names, and that's okay.
Yeah, I
This
don't
is not
care.
this is not sponsored by anyone in particular, but Apple has some apps now that work on iOS. Okay,
Okay.
so if you're listening to this and you're a Droid user, I'm sorry, but nothing's accurate quite yet because the mic calibration and specs are all kind of different between the Droid phones. But with Apple products, they're a little more consistent. So for iPhones and iPads, there is the NIOSH Sound Level Meter app. NIOSH is spelled NIOSH, and it's the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health.
Okay.
That app is accurate within 2 decibels. So it's gone through, some rigorous testing. White papers are out there, studies are out there that you can look up and see it compared to other apps. So it's accurate within 2 decibels, which is really quite good. And there were a couple studies showing that when you put in an external mic into your phone, it's accurate within 1 dB. So this is great not only for raising awareness of your own environment, but maybe for using with students. I think
hmm
this is a great way to get them thinking about hearing loss prevention. Apple also recently released the noise app for the Apple Watch. And that's pretty cool. It will, measure the noise around you and it'll let you know if it's hazardous or not. So also a cool thing. And again, to go back to, how do you actually measure sound? Okay, I said you can use an app. There's more to it than that. So something musicians like to do is focus on peaks of sound. So they'll say, oh my goodness, I measured in rehearsal and we peaked at, our sound level was 135. Well, that's not really your sound level. That might be a very split second transient sound that gets up to that loudness, but that's not truly your exposure. You want to look at your average over time. So, for example, if I'm a violinist and I say, well, I would really like to measure this rehearsal and see what I'm exposed to in the orchestra, I could turn on that app, try to sit it somewhere that, fairly close to my ear or maybe on my stand or something, or put a little table next to me. And I would want to average my exposure for the length of the rehearsal.
hmm
So when I get that final number, it's not going to be that peak of, 135. Maybe it'll be 90, something like that. I think that's such an important piece for your listeners, because there's a
Yeah.
big misconception that your exposure is your peak of sound. And certainly you're exposed to that, but you're gonna figure out what you need in terms of protection based on your average
Okay.
of sound exposure. Okay, so that's a pretty important piece of information. For example, on the NIOSH app, that average is called the LAQ. It's a capital L, capital A, and then lowercase EQ. And that's going to tell you really kind of what your exposure level is.
That's so awesome. I'm sure a lot of people listening right now could probably get that Apple phone, Watch app going like
Mm,
right now in rehearsal if they
yeah, and
wanted.
yeah, the other thing that I want to bring up in terms of sound exposure measurement is that sound, when we talk about it, there are different ways to weight sound. Weighting as in WEIGHT.
Okay.
And you might be tempted to weight it certain ways. The app that I mentioned will be an A weighting, and that's the scale that's used for hearing loss prevention. So that's really what you would want to be in when you're looking at risk to hearing. A lot of musicians like to use C weighting, and the reason for that is it takes into account more low frequencies. Okay,
Okay.
so often I will get questions from musicians saying, I measured the room I'm in with a sound level meter, and here's my measurement with C weighting. Or I'll get called from, a group of musicians and say, we want to know what our limit is in C weighting. The research that exists for hearing loss prevention is in A weighting. And
Okay.
it's effective. So that's my way of saying, if you're taking a sound level measurement for the purpose of hearing loss prevention, you want to be in A weighting.
Okay. So is that like something you can select on the app when you're using it?
On the app, I know it's automatic, and I don't have the app in front of me, so I'm not sure. Actually, let me grab my phone real quick. Yes, so on the app you can choose A, C, or Z, but
Mm.
A is the default setting. So
Okay.
if you wanted to take a measurement in C weighting, you certainly could. If you want to see, what that's like with more low frequencies taken into account. But again, in terms of hearing conservation, you want to be in A weighting.
Okay. Okay. Well, that makes sense, and that's a good piece of information to know when doing this. You mentioned the putting the microphone in the ear. So, I mean, I know that the options you've just described are just as good if you don't have that, but with the microphone in the ear, is that something that you do when you go to orchestras, or do you just is it something people could do if they really wanted to know? And how would they? That would require some equipment, right?
Yeah, and they shouldn't do it on their own. So
Okay.
if you're someone who really wants to do that, you would reach out to honestly, like a research facility would
Mm,
probably have the average audiologist does not have that kind of equipment.
right. Okay.
Um, but you could certainly reach out and have that done. It's very expensive equipment.
Mm,
Might take some time. For I think I want to put this the right way, because I think it's wonderful to take sound level measurements, and I think you should do so. I think using something like the app to at least get an idea is fine. And really, what's going to tell you if you're getting hurt or not is getting an annual hearing test. So, the reason I want to make such a huge deal out of that is we get so bogged down in music world looking at sound levels, talking about the newest gear, this and that, which is great. I mean, and we're all very not that we're detail oriented, but we're all sort of that personality type,
yeah.
where we want to like track everything and almost practice it. Like let's practice
Yeah.
taking sound levels. But really, what you should get in the practice of is going to the audiologist every year.
Mm,
And you brought up earlier about going to see the dentist, and the mindset when you go see the dentist is, man, I hope nothing has changed since the last time I was there.
yeah.
And sometimes what I see from people going to the audiologist is they almost seem like they don't want to come unless something is wrong.
It's
And it
a
kind of
it.
it kind of boggles my mind.
Yeah. They don't want to confront that there could be something wrong, right?
That could be it, or they feel like there's no need to go unless they have some kind of severe disorder.
Right. But that's like
But
saying I won't
but
go
the
to the
goal here,
dentist until my tooth is
right?
rotting out. Yeah.
Right, which some people do. I mean, honestly, we're all different, and I know some people, I know some musicians who would wait until something's really wrong. But the fact of the matter is, going to see the audiologist, to protect what I call your main instrument
Hmm.
is worth it, to make sure you're stable, because that's going to tell you everything you need to know. If your hearing protection is appropriately fit for you, if you're not being overexposed to sound, the goal is you see no changes on your hearing test year after year. I love when I see people who have been going to the audiologist before I was ever around, and they have a binder of 30 or 40 hearing tests where they've been going every year and they've been experiencing no change. Those are magical appointments to me.
That's awesome. That's great. So when people are listening to this now, maybe they're not going to get to the audiologist or be able to see you tomorrow. What are some things they can try right now? Because like I know I had mentioned to you, because I had the question of, is putting one, like I have at least the orchestra I played with and my husband plays with all the time now. They have a box of earplugs in backstage. So they're just like those
Hmm.
cheap foam ones. And when I played regularly there, I mean, we would end up on stages where we were really cramped in. There was a trumpet
Yeah.
right next to my head, and I just got to the point where I was like, look, my hearing is more important than whether or not I feel like totally great about how I sound right now. You know what I mean? Because I was like,
Yeah.
I really care. And so but sometimes if a loud part was immediately followed by something more exposed that I really did want to hear myself on, I would just put one plug in on like the right side or something.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic point to bring up. I find that there's a misconception with hearing protection that it's an all or nothing kind of thing. But your head, the mass sitting on top of your body, your head, does provide what's called a head shadow effect,
Hmm.
where one ear is slightly, less exposed than the other. So you brought up an example of a trumpet. If I'm playing and a trumpet's on my, let's say it's on my left side, my left ear is going to be more exposed than my right ear
Hmm.
because my right ear is slightly protected. That doesn't mean my right ear is safe,
Right.
but it's less exposed than the left. So if you have to make a judgment call, day of the show, it's a pops concert, you feel like you can't play with both in, that's okay. Pop one in.
Hmm.
The other thing is thinking about sound in terms of how is it really injuring you? What is causing that? Well, it's not just volume, it's length of exposure.
Hmm.
So if you're going to have a day with a lot of loud rehearsals, performance, you're also teaching, um, popping an earplug in occasionally to lessen your dosage of sound throughout your day is a great idea. And all of this is being said with the idea that you have the intention to go see an audiologist and get a baseline.
Okay.
But no, if you can't do that right away, if you're on the road for a couple months, maybe you're on tour for a while and you can't go see an audiologist, yeah, wearing one is fine. Um, I wanted to tie this into, I just thought of it, barriers and shields
Yes. Oh, that's
used
a
in
good question.
orchestras, because
Yes.
I get this question a lot in terms of, an orchestra will call me and they'll say, we want to do something immediately, and should we go out and buy $10,000 worth of sound shields.
Hmm.
Well, I used to, before I was even more hyper specialized, I used to say no. I used to just flat out say no. And the reason for that is when you look at the data in terms of studies that have been done with use of shields and barriers, they have yet to be proven effective in terms of scientific, evidence-based studies. So let me say that again. They have yet to be scientifically proven effective for hearing conservation. Now, the reason why I don't just say no anymore is because as we talk and continue the conversation, in terms of a global scale on musicians' wellness, yes, I'm talking about hearing, but mental wellness is also a component.
Hmm.
So if you are someone who is, maybe you're the last chair of the first violins, and they've set up percussion behind you, and you find it jarring, and you feel like you want to have a shield up behind you to be protected, that's a mental health thing.
Yeah.
And in that instance, that's a good thing. Having that behind you and feeling protected, as long as you know it's probably not offering you the amount of protection you need to keep your hearing safe, there is that other component of the feeling of safety. And I go back and forth with different providers and different specialists about this because no, it's not effective for hearing conservation. But for example, I sit on the wellness committee of the College Music Society, and we're having a lot of conversations right now about mental health and mental wellness.
Hmm.
And you could have your ears completely safe, but if you don't feel mentally well, what good is it? So anyway, that's sort of a long answer.
I can totally attest to feeling
Yeah.
really upset and like mad that I didn't feel cared for by the organization because here I am crammed in and there's a cymbal right behind my ear or a trumpet right next to my head and like, do you even care? Like, this is my health. And then like did you say that they haven't done the studies on the shields or that they
No,
have
they
and it
have.
hasn't? Okay.
They've been studied since I want to say the mid 80s, if not earlier. And the latest paper I read written on these was from 2017, so very recently. Um, Looking at, how much do they actually attenuate, and it might be a dB or two, but
Okay.
for them to be very effective, they need to be within 18 centimeters of your head. You sort of need to be totally surrounded, or they need to be maybe 6 feet high, which can
Oh,
be an issue for line of sight, to the conductor. For brass players listening to this, um, let me put myself in the brass player's shoes. So say I'm a trombonist and I have, a cellist sitting in front of me and they put a shield up. If it's something like plexiglass,
it's going to
my
bounce back
exposure,
at you.
yeah, my exposure is just increased by at least 3 dB,
Yeah.
which in like scientific terms could make me safe for half the time I was without that shield.
Okay.
So, you brought up a really interesting point and a point that a lot of people get angry about, which is sort of these decisions by management, things that are done, whether or not musicians are being cared for. And yes, management could go out and put shields up for everybody. I like what I'm seeing where a lot of management is really wanting to be educated. Some of the orchestras I work with have me do a separate educational session just for management and staff. Um,
That's
because
awesome.
they want to know how to effectively care. They don't want to just throw something, at a problem unless
Yeah.
they know it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So that's my way of saying I think things are changing. I'm thrilled, especially in the classical community, that people are really seeking good, scientific, evidence-based understanding of things.
Yeah.
Um, so the shields and barriers thing, that's a very complicated issue because there's more involved than just hearing protection. And I know the people who have shields, I've been in not shouting matches, but argument matches with, when I go out and do lectures, with musicians who love their shields.
Yeah. Well, listen, I
It's
I know
Yeah.
that's why I'm glad you brought it up because I spent so many years arguing with other musicians about shields because first of all, the person who's being protected is not thinking about the person who the sound is bouncing back at. And the
Hmm.
other thing is, as a horn player, like say someone who's sitting behind us, like or kind of to the right of our bells, if it's a string player, sometimes it's even percussionists who are resting, you know.
Hmm.
But the problem is, as a directionally challenged instrument player, like I'm facing backwards, if there's a shield, 5 inches from my bell, that's hurting my right ear, and so and it not only does it hurt, it messes you up for hearing other people, and musically it messes you up. So I agree that like while they probably give you some kind of psychological, at least I have a barrier between me or and the problem, it's really great that you remembered to bring this up because I want people to hear this. Like people are out and out argue over the barrier thing. Like they get
Yeah.
really mad at
Yeah.
each other. I mean, there's people who that I know who haven't talked in years because of a barrier argument, you know? Like
Yeah. The
it's
barrier
just
created a barrier in their friendship. And it's really an amazing thing. And it is maybe the most emotionally heated discussion I hear about hearing within the classical community is about
interesting.
barriers and shields. And I will say at this point in time, even though everything we've been saying is true, that there really isn't anything quite effective yet, there are people working on making new ones and experimenting.
Mm.
And it could be within the next couple years we see some new options. I know there's a fantastic bassoonist from National Symphony Orchestra, Steve Wilson. he's been experimenting with different types of shields and really creating some very interesting options.
Wow.
Of course, those would need to be studied. Before, it's not something I would say, oh yes, these are effective, because I need a lot of data on that
Mm-hmm.
and measurement and to see if they are. But those of you who are listening, who, if you're still listening, or if you've turned this off because you're upset, I do think there probably are some good barriers and shields on the horizon, because I know personally people who are working on this.
Right.
So yeah, so that's, we'll leave it at that.
Personally, I've noticed when I've used them, I mean, we have this other kind of shield that's like, imagine kind of a partition that's attached to a stand, and you can put it so it's just around your head.
Hmm.
And that one, I think, while it doesn't take away like you can't just go, okay, I have my shield up now, I don't need my plugs, because you still have a problem there. I think it reduces it enough to where it goes from massively painful to just painful. I don't know. Like it's definitely not
Right.
solving a problem.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Those shields that are soft material and are closer to you are going to do more than the plexiglass, sort of flat shields you put up
Oh, they have a
behind
soft.
you.
I don't. Ours wasn't a soft one. It was like a formed plexiglass piece on the top of
Oh,
a music stand that you could raise and lower. But
there are
that.
soft ones.
Oh,
And a soft one would certainly do a little bit more than the plexiglass
yeah.
ones. But again, to be really effective, it would need to be so close to you and go up over your head, basically like a big helmet, um,
Let's all wear
which would be
helmets.
interesting. Uh, but you raised a really good point about the feeling of sound, and again, this is something that, not just mental health, but if someone has a condition like hyperacusis, where they're sensitive to sound, and they feel good, even just having maybe a 1 dB reduction from a shield, wow, that's a reason to have it.
Right.
So, yeah, so there's good points and bad points. Um, I wanted to touch on another aspect of hearing protection and shields. You brought it up a minute ago, and it sort of triggered my memory. And that is, you said something like, it messes up the sound. That's so true, even with ear level hearing protection.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I wanted to tell you why. Why it gets the sound so messed up. I said earlier in our conversation about the acoustic resonance of the ear canal, um, and how that naturally amplifies sound. And every listener who's listening to this right now is hearing this in a different way. And I could test everyone's hearing who's listening to this. They could all have identical hearing tests, but they're not hearing the same way, because all the anatomy is individual. All the perception of sound is individual. Even your history throughout your life of how you've been exposed to sound is individual. And all of that rolled together makes up how you hear. As soon as you put in something that changes that perception of sound, or maybe you put up a barrier or a shield, it's not going to feel right, because it's not going to sound right.
Mm-hmm.
So there is sort of an ear training period between, earplugs, shields, anything you might be using, because it's changing the overall resonance and the way the sound is coming into your ear. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does.
So, one thing I say to music teachers is, wouldn't it be great if we could get every child as they start music school and make them orally or sound wise bilingual, meaning they learn how to train to the open ear canal response, and they learn how to train to an earplug response.
Mm.
And so they're comfortable in either condition, just like going between being fluent in two languages. But what we find is people train for decades, and then they become pro musicians, in their whatever, maybe 40s, and they're getting their first pair of earplugs, and they do have a hard time getting used to
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Because life gets busy and you don't
Yeah.
necessarily have, hours to dedicate to training to earplugs. It's possible to do so, first of all. So it's not hopeless.
So you're
I've got
saying people can practice with earplugs in just to get used to
Oh,
it?
yes, I
Okay.
recommend it. Usually when someone gets a pair of earplugs from me, I'll say, don't wear these right away. Don't pop these in for your gig, or you'll never wear them again.
Mm.
Put one in, play a little bit. Put the other one in, play a little bit. Maybe record yourself playing with the earplugs in and listen back, sort of to prove that nothing's really changing in your playing. There are many strategies for ear training to earplugs. But beyond that, to talk about earplugs, there are really two overarching categories.
Okay.
There are passive earplugs, which we think of as like the musician's earplugs, the custom with the filter. Those are passive, meaning they don't have circuitry or a power source like a battery.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are active earplugs. So active earplugs have circuitry, have a dedicated power source. Um, Sometimes those are better. There's something new coming out, which I won't say quite what it is, other than you can contact me if you wanna know more. But it's a tunable system, so it would be hearing protection that actually over an app you EQ to sound the way you want it to sound. So you can EQ it to sound like your open ear, and then just turn that sound down. Um,
What?
yeah, I know. I'm extremely excited about it, but the product hasn't been released yet, so I'm not gonna say the name or anything. I'm thrilled. I've already got a few orchestras who have contacted me to order these things, because even though I hate to say this, there are a lot of studies showing why musicians underutilize hearing protection, and it's mostly because they're undereducated and they might not have the amount of time they need to ear train to them. Uh, and speaking personally, I'll probably get some flack for this, but I'm going to say it anyway because I work as a musician too. Wearing earplugs sometimes can just be so disappointing
Mm-hmm.
uh, in terms of performance.
Yep.
And even though it's really fulfilling because you're saving your most valuable asset, which is your hearing,
Yeah.
it can be disappointing in that you really wanted it to sound a certain way based on what you've been training to your whole life. And
Exactly.
you almost feel like you missed out on that experience. And audiologists will hate me for saying that, but well, maybe not hate me, but they'll probably say, well, you shouldn't say that. But it's true.
Yeah, and that means
Um,
a whole lot coming from you too, because you understand where musicians are coming from. Like, the only reason why we wouldn't put it in is because we don't like how we sound with them in.
right.
That's the only reason. Otherwise, if we sounded the same as when we had them in versus when we had them out, we would just wear them all the time because it's smart to protect your hearing. But like,
Correct.
when you have them in, you don't feel like, I'm just speaking from experience. I don't trust that I can do what I normally do on the horn with them in because it doesn't feel the same. And it sounds like when you're yawning, it sounds like you hear all the sounds in your mouth. You hear like all these
Yeah.
weird things that you normally wouldn't hear when you're playing, and it's distracting. And then what
Yeah.
about
Mhm.
hearing? Like, you need to hear better the person that you're trying to tune with, and all these different things that are a concern.
Right.
So, and like, so are the custom earplugs, I mean, those electronic ones sound amazing. How are they different from, as far as how you hear yourself? How are custom earplugs different from the foam ones that you shove in your ears?
Great question. And also great because you're a horn player. So I wanted to bring up what you mentioned about that sort of yawning thing, which I'll
Yeah.
get to in a minute.
Okay.
Um, so foam earplugs, when they're fully inserted in your ear, meaning you've put them in properly and they're blocking as much as they can, often, number one, will block more sound than you need to be blocked.
Okay.
And number two, they don't have what's called a flat frequency response. And what that means is they take out more treble than bass.
Okay.
So the musician's earplugs that have a filter will attenuate frequencies or pitches fairly equally across the spectrum, across most of the spectrum.
Okay.
Okay, so meaning that treble and bass are brought down fairly equally. These days, there are several filter manufacturers. There used to just be one. So I would, take note of what filter you're getting from the
Mm-hmm.
audiologist. But the custom earplugs, a lot of the sound quality is dictated by how the ear impressions are taken for them to be made, how they're manufactured, what the audiologist tells the manufacturer, what filter is used. All these things are taken into account. With a horn player or anybody who uses a mouthpiece, whether it's a reed or maybe you're, a trombonist or maybe you're
Yeah.
play bagpipes, whatever. Of course, that would be a reed too, I guess. But my point is, when you're getting the ear impressions taken for earplugs, it's preferable that you would play your instrument while that's being done.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah. So the reason for that is your ear canal is primarily cartilage. There is a bony portion that doesn't move so much, but anytime you're doing something by playing your instrument or talking or anything, your ear canals are moving.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to kind of capture all that. So that's number one. There's more to be taken into account, like what type of material is used to take the ear impressions. Um, and I don't want to get into this too much because I realize a lot of you might not be able to see one of us music audiologists who would do all of this, and I don't want you to go to the audiologist and sort of feel bad if they don't have the material I would use. But I think one of the two main things you can do and you can control in that appointment is asking if you can bring your instrument and play it, and asking the audiologist to take a really deep ear impression.
Okay.
The deeper you can go into the ear canal with the earplug, the less of that effect you'll have, which is known as the occlusion effect, or sometimes people call it the head in the barrel effect.
Deeper. The deeper you go.
Mhm. Yeah, so you want to get pretty deep into the ear canal. That occlusion effect is created by an airspace basically between your eardrum and the end of the earplug,
Okay.
where certain molecules of sound, get trapped essentially, and they're bouncing around in there, and it almost sounds like the low frequencies are being over amplified in a
Mm-hmm.
way. And so the more you can reduce that space, so putting that earplug deeper, the better chance you'll have of lessening that effect.
So you had mentioned overprotection to me, and I thought overprotection meant shoving them in too far, but that's not.
No, so
Okay.
overprotection is using too much attenuation. Um, so I mentioned like wearing a foam earplug properly, although most players don't. But if they were to use it properly, they might get 30 to 40 dB of protection.
Okay.
That's a lot. That's a lot. The goal with hearing protection is to be protected, but you don't want to overdo it. Number one, because it makes it harder to play.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it does. We all know it. And number two, for example, if you're someone who is dealing with some sound sensitivity, your gut reaction is to plug yourself up more because it feels good. So it
Yeah.
feels like you're doing the right thing, but you can actually worsen your sensitivity to sound.
Wow.
So you don't want to overdo the protection. And in terms of us, speaking on a podcast, there are so many nuances from patient to patient where, if I had someone sitting in front of me and we were talking about this, I would make it individualized to them and help them choose
Right.
hearing protection that way. But it's hard to make a general statement to anyone listening,
That makes
other than
sense.
to say you don't necessarily want to overprotect, because there are some issues that can come along with that.
Right. But then you don't know how much they're overprotecting or what that means because we're speaking generally right now. So it helps
Yeah,
to
yeah,
see somebody. Yeah. And I know that I think I mentioned to you that I've done where, like, okay, I still want to hear myself and there's something that's potentially going to hurt me on my left side, but I need my left ear to hear. You'd think it was I don't know, it just depends on what I'm doing. Usually I think I don't know, but sometimes I'll put it in lightly for that thing because I really need to hear myself. And then I'll shove it in harder when the loud part comes or something like that. But
yeah. And you do, honestly, we can talk about hearing protection till the cows come home,
yeah.
but the thing is, us as musicians, performance is number one.
Yeah.
And so you do what you have to do to perform your best. And I don't expect anyone listening to this to sort of do a 180 and suddenly overnight they're an expert at protecting their hearing. This is certainly a process. And something you do in conjunction with an audiologist or with me, or anyone who works in this field, to sort of train yourself over time. And there are certainly going to be gigs where you feel like, I can't put this earplug from the dreaded bowl of foam backstage in my ear right now.
Right.
And so, again, something like the tunable hearing protection or electronic helps resolve some of those issues where, it'll make some judgments for you in terms of protection, which can come in really handy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's not a one size fits all. It's just
Right.
not.
So
So
that of course that always applies to any kind of medical advice, right? So it applies here too.
that's exactly right.
Yeah. So I want to know, how do people get to you? How can they make an appointment with you? Where are you located? How do they bring you to their orchestra if this applies to them? Because, after our first call, I was like, I need to connect you with the person here,
Right.
who's, because this is so important. Like the contract here, my husband's in the orchestra here, and they just got approved that they get some money towards towards custom earplugs, and I'm like, like you had said, you need to do this right. Don't mess it up.
Right.
So
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, exactly.
how do you get in touch? How do you get how can people get you where they are, if there's in a school or an orchestra or whatever? Like, tell us all that information.
Okay, so the clinic I run is called Sound Check Audiology, and you can certainly look me up online. It's soundcheckaudiology.com, and my contact information is on there, as well as some testimonials and the typical website stuff. My email address is heather@soundcheckaudiology.com. Email really is the quickest way to reach me, so I'm not even going to bother giving my phone number. I'm a millennial, so I'm more likely to respond to email than a voicemail.
Yeah.
So email is great. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, at Soundcheck Audiology.
Okay.
And in terms of doing a program, if you're at a music school or you're at an orchestra and you're wondering about pricing and things like that, I have a document that I can send you that has all of that information, and the breakdown and sort of how that works. And then in terms of getting me out for a program, it's just a matter of logistics and seeing if it would work out. If you're someone who isn't part of a group like that, so you're on your own, you're listening to this, and now you think, man, I'm not going to be able to get good care. That is so not true. So I mentioned you can go see your local audiologist. I often have what I call remote visits with people. Like I said, a phone call to talk about things, to help them decide what they might need individually, basically like a consultation. And I'm happy to do that. I also have friends who are music audiologists.
That's
so if you can't see me, or maybe I don't jive with you as a provider, I want you to be with someone you feel comfortable with. And if that's not me, I can point you to somebody else. We all have those moments where we go see, a specialist or something, and you're thinking, man, I know they're like the expert, but I would rather have, a man or a woman, an older woman or someone who I can identify more with. That's fine. I'll help you find somebody.
That's nice. That's great. And you're not even offended.
No, I mean, again, this is healthcare.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
my main goal is getting you care, the best care for you. Whether that's me or not, the goal is getting you cared for.
That's so generous. Okay, well, I'm going to make sure that all of your website, your social media outlets, and also your email are in the show notes so people can contact you, because I'm super fired up. I want to get these earplugs, whether you end up coming here or I have to take a road trip, because I'm really interested in this. I want this for my hearing. This is so great. So thank you so much, Heather, for being on the show today. I've had the best time getting all this information out, and I can't wait to share it with my audience.
Thanks so much for having me, Tracy.
I'm Tracy Friedlander, and you've been listening to the Crushing Classical podcast. You can follow Crushing Classical on Instagram and Facebook at Crushing Classical. If you haven't yet, you can go to Apple Podcast and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Your reviews help others to find these conversations. Thanks for listening.